Thank you, Dr. Roshan, and a very good morning to all the participants, and particularly say I'm very thankful to Ambassador Rajagopalan, who has always been present and listening to our presentation, and of course, Dr. Sinha, I would say, who's a leading authority on geopolitics of water in our region and is written extensively on the subject. Anurag has been working on this project, in fact, for last year plus, and I have seen from his initial research was very good, and I'm sure that in due course of time he'll come out with a very good book. Now, as we know, in the international system today, in the geopolitics, the critical drivers of geopolitics are domination of resources and water being a very important resource, locations, trade, technology, and all these put together, they create a political heft for a country in the international system. And we also know that today the state-to-state conflicts in their uh, conventional form has become more rare, and we are more into the gray zone conflicts. And in our neighborhood, both China and Pakistan, they are past masters in gray zone conflicts. And water can also become an important tool in this gray zone conflict, particularly in this triangle between India, China, and Pakistan, where there are competitive advantages and there are asymmetries in the water relations. And it has its effect on other countries in the region, like our relations with Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and even China's relations with Myanmar. Or to a large extent, they are determined by the geopolitics of water. As we know that China is an upper riparian state and it is not a signatory to UN resolution. And Tibet being the water tower of Asia, China holds a significant strategic leverage of water. Uh, that how it controls water, but more importantly, water is also a criticality for China because its northern region is more water stressed and very high in population density. Therefore, probably there is an imperative need for China to uh, sort of push this water, divert this water from southern region to the northern region. And also, after Three Gorges Dam, now they become much more ambitious and they want to dam the Sangpo River and create a dam which is far bigger than, as we read in the reports, is on than the Three Gorges Dam. So it has its own effect on the geopolitics of the region. Likewise, in India-Pakistan relation, we know that Indus Water Treaty is one of the issues, and from time to time here in India, without realizing much, we talk about unilateral abrogation of the treaty. But then we don't know what to do with these waters and where do we stand and whether we can really do it or not. So when we come to Bhutan, probably this hydropower is one of the major factor in our harmonious relations with Bhutan because that's given a boost to Bhutanese economy and there is some kind of complementarity and interdependence. With Nepal, yes, there is a tremendous potential, though about Kosi River and other things, there many a times we have some contentious issues emerging. But on the whole, I think if there is one area where India can make a significant entry into Nepal is the hydropower, and probably we can uh, duplicate the Bhutanese model there. And there are other countries like Bhutan, sorry, Bangladesh, which gets affected if Chinese do something to water. And other thing we've seen very recently in Uttarakhand is the ecological degradation because of unmindful and unscientific uh, development of these water resources. And if Chinese do the kind of growth and development they are doing to capitalize these water resources, it can have a very devastating ecological effect, and the lower riparian states will probably suffer the consequences. So I'm sure that our scholar will look at a whole range of these issues. He would have already done his chapter one, and now in this chapter, and Dr. Sinha will be able to guide us wherever we try to go off the tangent, so that it is a very well informed research and a good book that we are able to produce, authored by Anurag and a USI publication. So, with these words, I now hand over to our scholar, Colonel Anurag Jyoti, to just give his part of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Jan Sharma, and Dr. Roshan for the introduction. And sir, all the issues that you have just flagged again, I have noted them down. Some of them I was already covering, but be rest assured that all the issues that you mentioned, they will be covered in the book as and when it comes out. Uh, Good morning, everybody. This is the topic of my book, Asymmetric Warfare: Water as a Geostrategic Tool in India's Neighborhood. Uh, I have always been, had this quotation of Sun Tzu at the back of my mind since my early days in the service. And being a mechanized forces officer, uh, having to win without fighting or win with a lesser force against a larger force has been the uh, thought process or the way I have been trained. But I've always been fascinated with this, though this quotation is in the military domain. But it had set me thinking that in the present scenario, what are the other issues which we can utilize or use to see in case we can, assert our will in the neighborhood. So this is the basis on which I had started or thought of the topic that I am presenting today. This is the way I am going to present today. I'll just briefly go over the chapterization in 2 minutes, just so that the audience is aware how the book is going to be laid out and what the flow of the book is going to be. And also, I would request for the comments or inputs or what points I can add or delete at the end of it. So that will help me further. Beyond that, the first three chapters I'll be covering today. Broadly, the first chapter in this which I'm going to present today, this is what it is going to have. Basically, I'm building up that as to why we need to look at uh, issues beyond military, beyond kinetic, as an add-on to what we can do to address our adversaries. This is basically more or less factual. It traces the history of the hydropolitics, how the hydropolitics have evolved in the world, and the various theories which are there, and how, based on these theories, the various countries have the upper riparians, they act in a different manner, and a lower riparian acts in a different manner. So all those issues have been covered, though I'm not covering in so much of detail today for want of time. But in the written part, I have covered, including given examples of how the various countries of South Asia and Southeast Asia have also been reacting to these uh, international laws. The third chapter is on the start of the Indus Water Treaty, in the sense that what was the history of the Indus Water Treaty and how it has panned out. I must confess that a lot of it I have taken from the seminar which I had attended, which was given by Dr. Sinha in December 19, and plus his book, Riverine Neighborhood, and the other writings that he's been doing. In addition, there are a number of other books. Obviously, N.D. Gulati's uh, Exercise in International Mediation, That was one basis. There is a book by David Hines, Brahmachalani, uh, and large number of articles, Bashir Malik, Abdul Wahid, and all these people. So I have gone through all their details. So this is again more or less the dates and all are fixed, and so that is what the three chapters that I'm going to be covering today. Uh, Coming to the chapter 4, this is where the actual part will begin, which will be in the subsequent presentation. That as to how what all we need to do to leverage our position as a status as upper riparian within the Indus Waters Treaty, within the accepted transboundary international transboundary water laws, and what leeway do we have within the Indus Water Treaty to you know uh, impact the agrarian economy of Pakistan. These are the certain other things. There are also issues of India not being able to fully utilize the waters of the eastern rivers also. And even if we do that, that is also going to cause a big stress, water stress over Pakistan. Chapter 5, I'm looking at the neighboring countries of in these within South Asia, and basically between China, the collusion between China and Pakistan. Nepal is becoming a kind of a little bit of a headache for India. So we have a number of tributaries of Ganges, which start from Tibet, flow through Nepal, and come into the Ganges. So can Nepal and China get together with Pakistan, without Pakistan, and affect the flows of water? Our interaction with Afghanistan, because one of the tributaries that the of Indus River is the Kabul River, and a number of other tributaries also. So the area of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, uh, Peshawar, that area is quite dependent on that water of Kabul River. So anything that we can do in conjunction with Afghanistan. So those are the issues that I intend covering in this chapter. And finally, the last chapter will be the way forward. As during my previous presentation, Dr. Sinha had advised that I should look at the IWT in three major heads of what happens if we abrogate. Are there any chances of any legal provisions, and or we optimize or we renegotiate? So this is how I am going to be forming this chapter, working on this chapter. Then the impact of climate change and way forward with all the neighbors. So this is the broad framework of the book that is going to be that I have worked out for myself. I have done most of the research, but for the later chapters, a little bit of work more is in the pipeline. I'll now come to my first chapter, the spectrum of future conflict in the era of globalization and economic interdependence, especially with reference to the Indian subcontinent. Uh, India's geopolitical location has a maverick and almost a failed nation, that is Pakistan, onto its west, and an assertive China towards north, with whom we have a long unsettled border issue. Keeping these two belligerents in mind, India needs a strong multispectral force capable of addressing multidimensional, asymmetrical, non-contiguous, and non-linear threats in a hybrid environment. With a dependable nuclear deterrence posture emerging, India is now moving towards a credible or oblique or punitive deterrence. And to build up this capability against both our Western and Northern adversaries will require a tremendous amount of financial resources, which would directly impact our efforts to develop the nation economically and do meaningful poverty alleviation. So, keeping these two mutually exclusive requirements in mind, and yet recognizing the urgent need for upgrading our strategic deterrence, there is a need to look at options other than kinetic and non-kinetic warfare. Now, in this chapter, I'm going to stick my neck out and I'm going to make certain assertions. Uh, so kindly bear with me. I am fairly convinced about them. So I'll talk about them as I move forward. Uh, the generations of warfare, a quick look at the various generations of warfare, which started from the first and now fifth and sixth generation warfare is in the is available to now us, and heading even towards the seventh generation, which is talking of AI, etc. It reveals that all these generations of warfare are mainly in the military domain and do not take into consideration the newer dimensions which have been introduced into the conflict lexicon with the cyber, information, human, and the economic domains. As the authors of Unrestricted Warfare bring out in the preface of their book, we have to acknowledge that the principles of war are no longer using armed forces to compel the enemy to submit to one's will, but rather are using all means, military and non military, lethal and non lethal, to compel the enemy to accept one's will. So now, one of the issues is the comprehensive national power. So rather than seeking recourse to only military power as a tool to pursue our strategic objectives, the comprehensive national power, or the sum total of all the strengths available to a nation, is a much better index of measuring this capability. To study and analyze the CNP, essential factors which need to be considered are as flashed on the viewfoil. I would, though all of them which are given are very, very important, starting with the military and the economy. But I want to look at the geography and the natural resources as to how we can utilize them as part of our CNP. So that is the focus of my presentation today. Okay, now talking of military as a component of CNP, here is a comparison. You see, China, India, Pakistan, China is more than a 14 trillion economy. India is somewhere close to 2.8 trillion, and Pakistan is just flat and just about starting out. As is clearly evident from the graphics, the three neighbors have been spending a colossal amount of money over the years to keep their armed forces equipped and modernized. In spite of that, there is always a discussion, especially in India, around the shortfall of budgetary support for upgrading and maintaining a credible superiority and a punitive conventional deterrence against at least our Western neighbor, while ensuring a dissuasive posture in the short to medium term against the northern adversary. However, maintaining such a large army at such a high expense makes it unreasonable and hence presents an opportunity to look at a different approach to offset this high cost, which can actually be gainfully utilized for upgrading the economic, health, infrastructure, and other such non-military indicators of the nation. It is not to make a case that the conventional forces need to be downsized or are likely to lose their significance as an important instrument in the comprehensive national power. With the evolving concepts, we need to look at ways and means other than war and the newer domains like the cyber, information, human, political, and economic as part of the CNP to help us impose a justified will in the region. With increased literacy and an aspirational population means that the government has to look after the needs of education, health care, employment, and general well-being. This can only happen if there is rapid economic growth. Under these circumstances, any conflict, big or small, can extract too heavy an economic price and can also set the country back by many years. The examples of some of the countries which are in or have recently exited conflicts like Iraq, Syria, Armenia, Azerbaijan, etc., are there for all of us to see. So, conflict avoidance becomes a carry for most governments. Okay, efficacy of a nuclear deterrence. I mentioned that a credible nuclear deterrence actually just lets you fight a conventional war in peace. Nuclear deterrence has been around for at least 75 years. Not used ever since 1945, even though we had an extended Cold War between NATO and Warsaw Pact countries, and events like the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of a cataclysmic World War III, but it never happened. In the Indo-Pak context, nuclear deterrence is there, though that hasn't stopped Pakistan from waging a relentless hybrid war. So does it mean that in spite of having a nuclear deterrence, it provides a scope for a wide spectrum of offensive operations against the adversary over an escalatory ladder, including probably a full spectrum conventional war? Also, the international community is likely to step in much before to rein in a rogue country in the event that a nuclear exchange looks imminent. Thus, it leads to a likely conclusion, that nuclear weapons are meant to deter a nuclear exchange but provide ample scope for conducting conventional operations below a nuclear threshold. It also implies that India may not be able to use its nuclear deterrence to stop Pakistan from pursuing its hybrid warfare, and therefore needs to look at options beyond nuclear to put a stop to her activities or at least deter her. Demographic dividend. Okay, from the present 1.38 billion, India's population is expected to grow to 1.65 billion by the year 2059. And the dependency ratio is expected to remain between 48.7 at present and go up till 52 by the year 2060, which is quite low and means that India is in the midst of a demographic dividend. Dependency ratio relates to the number of children and older persons to the working age population of 15 to 65 years old. So the lower the dependency ratio is, the better it is. That means there are more people who are working and lesser dependent mouths to feed. In case of India, demographic dividend implies a well-educated, English literate, tech-savvy working population which is earning and creating a huge marketplace with enormous appetite for consumption. All this combined with a stable democracy, peaceful environment, and investment-friendly policies will not only continue to attract large amounts of foreign investment, but availability of cheap and appropriately skilled labor force will keep acting as a magnet for large corporates and MNCs to set up manufacturing facilities in India. With multi-billion dollars of investment and ever-expanding consumer market, the world's major industrialized nations will have a big stake in ensuring that the country continues to grow and remain stable. And for the stability of their economic interests, the powers that be of the world will ensure that the countries inimical to India are kept in check. So to that extent, a large working population in a stable democracy also contributes in a big way towards a kind of a strategic deterrence. Okay, economic warfare in the Pakistani context. Economic warfare includes the use of economic means to compel an adversary to change its policies or behavior. Unfortunately, in case of India and Pakistan, due to the continued hostilities, it has meant that the trade and commerce never reached its true potential. As per the latest trade figures which are flashed on the viewfoil, India exported goods worth $2 billion and imported only 494 in fiscal 18-19, while in 19-20 the figures have come down drastically to 0.82 billion of exports and only 14 million in imports, which is a precipitous drop of 60 and 97% respectively. With such low volumes of trade and commerce happening between the two belligerents, the option of any meaningful economic warfare is effectively ruled out. Why I thought of looking at it was because of the trade war between USA and China, which Donald Trump had started, but a lot of reports that I read, or a lot of research papers that I've read, they all have said that ultimately it has bounced back on USA, and USA lost much more than possibly what China lost in this. So, an in-depth analysis of the Indo-Pakistan strategic interaction shows that even though Pakistan is a much smaller economy vis-a-vis India, yet it has managed to successfully wage a hybrid war against India. India has been taking many measures, both kinetic and non-kinetic, to address the belligerents, but we've not been able to effectively counter Pakistan. And again, we need to look at certain measures other than what we've done till now, to look at how we can bring Pakistan to heel. So one of the major resource which, as General B.K. Sharma had mentioned, for the resource warfare, one of the biggest resource that we have is the shared river waters. And with India being the upper riparian to most of the major rivers flowing into Pakistan, there is a need to analyze how this fact can be leveraged to threaten, if not adversely impact, the heavily canal irrigation based agrarian economy of Pakistan by use of water as a strategic tool in order to temper the proclivity of Pakistan for waging hybrid warfare against India. So if you look at this this graphic, more than 18% of the economy is agrarian. and this combined with the 74% external water dependency, which Dr. Roshan had also alluded to, there is a option for us to look at this as a ways of bringing Pakistan to heel. So this is basically which I had laid out, that we need to probably start focusing on issues other than kinetic and or the military as part of the comprehensive national park. Now coming to the chapter number 2, which is the history of the hydropolitics. Water has rightfully been called the elixir of life and is a prerequisite that nature has provided to sustain life on earth. Transboundary waters, the river basins, lakes, and aquifers shared by 2 or more countries support the lives and livelihood of vast number of people across the world. Combined with the impact of climate change and ever-increasing population and economic growth, requires an internationally recognized integrated approach to transboundary water resource management based on legal and institutional framework and shared benefits and costs. There are 276 transboundary lake and river basins which cover almost half the Earth's surface. 148 countries have some part of their territory in these basins, while more than 39 countries have their entire territories between one or more of these basins. There are approximately 300 transboundary aquifers helping to serve the 2 billion people who depend on groundwater. Even with these statistics, there are more than 1 billion people who do not have access to even safe drinking water. Since 1948, there have been 37 incidents of acute conflict over water, while approximately 295 international water agreements were negotiated and signed in the same period. All this details or data are from the UN FAO and the other UN websites. Coming to the dynamics of the transboundary waters, firstly, UN has variously described transboundary water as transboundary waters means any surface or groundwater which mark, cross, or are located on the boundaries between 2 or more states. So this is the definition which was given in the UN ECE Water Conventions of 1992, which I'll be coming to subsequently. And the UN Watercourses Convention of 1997, it defines watercourses as transboundary waters as the watercourse system of surface waters and groundwaters constituting by virtue of their physical relationship a unitary whole and normally flowing into a common terminus. It means what is it was said in the first this thing, but because there were many more countries involved in the negotiations, so that is why everybody had its say in making it a bit ambiguous. Okay, to address these issues and these questions and the various theories, the issues of water sharing of waters, various theories and doctrines and principles have been developed over the decades, and these are as flashed on the viewfoil: the theory of absolute territorial sovereignty, integrity, limited territorial sovereignty, and the community of interest. I'll just go over them one by one and just briefly. The doctrine of absolute territorial sovereignty over transboundary waters was born out of the international law about territorial sovereignty. It gained prominence during the dispute over the utilization of waters of River Rio Grande between US and Mexico towards the end of the 19th century. Mexico raised an objection with the US about the latter's unilateral decision to divert large quantities of water for its domestic use. The then US Attorney General James Judson Harmon was asked to prepare an opinion. The opinion tendered by Harmon in 1895 has come to now be known as the popular Harmon Doctrine, and he wrote that the fundamental principle of international law is the absolute sovereignty of each state as opposed to all others on its territory. The jurisdiction of the state in its own territory is exclusive and absolute, which meant that what he said was that what a country does with the waters in its own territory, nobody else can object to it. This theory is, however, not recognized as representing international law as the concept of absolute territorial sovereignty cannot be applied to a life supporting resource which is not bound by the confines of a nation's territory. So the next theory which was being utilized, or which is there in the water lexicon, is the theory of absolute territorial integrity. This theory favors the downstream states wishing to prohibit any development in an upstream state that would interfere with the natural flow of a transboundary watercourse. It basically implies that any activity by the upper riparian should have the consent of the downstream states in case the action is in any way going to impact the quantity or quality of water or alter the flow in the water body. Although it has also not been recognized as part of international law, but just as the previous theory has been quoted by the upper riparian states, similarly the lower riparians have been quoting this theory while asserting their water rights. The next one is the theory of limited territorial sovereignty. This is a more balanced concept and is widely accepted as the foundation upon which the general laws and principles of international watercourse have evolved and which are embodied within the provisions of the UN Watercourse Convention. This doctrine stipulates that all watercourse states enjoy an equal right to the utilization of a shared resource, and each watercourse state must respect the sovereignty and reciprocal rights of the other watercourse states. Okay, so this was a balance between the earlier two, and the last one is the community of interest, which is the latest concept, and it derives from the idea that a community of interest in the water is created by the natural, physical, and also social unity of the watercourse. It assumes that by its nature, water is a common property and should be shared by the community. Plus, it also enjoins on the people who are sharing, or the countries or the states who are sharing the water, to ensure that there is no harm in terms of pollution, etc., which is done to the water course. There are certain principles of the international water law which have been worked out, and based on which the various treaties which are, whether under the aegis of the UN convention or otherwise, which have happened between the states. So these are the certain principles of international water law which are used while while negotiating the treaties. And in fact, these are also the principles which are utilized by the International Court of Justice whenever it arbitrates on water issue, in case the countries approach it. So now the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization. This principle requires each state to use international watercourse on its territory in a reasonable manner, ensuring that its needs are met without compromising those of the neighboring states. Obligation not to cause significant harm. I mean, these are all self-explanatory. The principle presents aspects of the theory of limited sovereignty. The obligation of not causing significant harm requires that no state bordering an international watershed should use the water resources of the watercourse on its territory in a manner as to cause harm to the other state in the same basin. The principle of notification, consultation, and negotiation. Every riparian state in an international watercourse is entitled to prior notice, consultation, and negotiation in cases where the proposed use by another riparian of a shared watercourse may cause harm to the other's rights and interests. Principle of cooperation and information exchange, basically that the development of a watercourse should be done in conjunction with each other, and the information regarding, or the data regarding the water flow, etc., needs to be exchanged across the co-riparians. The principle of peaceful settlement of disputes. It says over the use of the protection of shared watercourse resources is again one of the cardinal principles of international water law. And it says that initially it should start off with a mutual discussion, followed by a neutral expert, or ultimately heading to the International Court of Justice. Okay, based on these principles and the doctrines which have been given out earlier, there are a large number of agreements and conventions which have been done over the period of years. But I am going to cover the main three ones. three main ones. There are a whole lot of others, but I'm basically focusing on these three. First is the Helsinki rules on the uses of waters of international rivers. The International Law Association adopted the Helsinki rules on the uses of waters of international rivers at its 52nd conference in August 66, and hence they are called Helsinki Rules on the Uses of Waters of International Rivers 1966. Over the years, it has become widely acknowledged as basis for negotiation among riparian states over shared waters, and it defines the international drainage basin as a geographical area extending over two or more states determined by the watershed limits of the system of waters, including surface and underground waters flowing into a common terminus. The 1966 Helsinki Rules endorsed the principle of cooperation, information sharing, consultation, negotiation, and peaceful settlement of disputes. Now, while the Helsinki Rules are important in the development of international water law, however, they were drafted by a professional organization and hold no official status internationally. The work of ILA, or the International Law Association, has always been regarded as inspirational and not hard and fast rules for the state conduct. Although they are deemed unofficial, but they are accorded great value because the subsequent modern bilateral and regional treaties have tended to accept the guidelines provided by the Helsinki rules. Okay, the 1992 UNECE Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and the International Lakes. Throughout the world, contaminated water is still responsible for some 7% of all deaths and diseases. In the region of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe alone, that is Europe, Central Asia, North America, and Israel, an estimated 120 million people do not have access to safe drinking water and adequate sanitation. And as a result, they are more vulnerable to serious water-related diseases. More than 150 major rivers, and 50 large lakes are shared between two or more countries. 20 European countries depend on more than 10% of their water resources on their neighboring countries, and 5 countries draw 75% of their resources from upstream countries. So the UNECE Water Conventions, which were adopted in 1992 and which entered into force in 1996, provide a legal framework for the regional cooperation on shared water resources. In 2003, actually, the success of the convention led the parties to amend it and opening it for ratification and utilization by countries even outside the UNECE region. The treaty was signed in 1992 and came into force on 6th October 1996. Coming to the last one, or the most important one, is the UN Convention on Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses, 1997. After considerable discussion from 1991 to 1997 on the International Law Commission draft, in fact, the International Law Commission had taken more than 2 decades, or 23 years, to prepare this draft, which was subsequently discussed for close to 6 years in the UN. And finally, UN General Assembly adopted the Convention on Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses, widely known as the UN Watercourses Convention, on 21st May 1997. This convention codified the principles of sharing international watercourses while building on the 1966 Helsinki Rules. It has got a large number of articles, which I'm not going to touch upon all of them, but just some of the important ones. Article 5 adopts the theory of equitable and reasonable utilization and states that watercourse states shall, in their respective territories, utilize an international watercourse in an equitable and reasonable manner. Article 6 requires states to enter into consultation. Article 10 states that in case of there is any conflict, it forbids implementation of any planned measures till the time that conflict resolution has not been carried out. The principle of cooperation and information exchange is also endorsed, and it advocates an obligation to cooperate for the optimal utilization and adequate protection of the international watercourses. Now, the treaty was signed at New York on 21st May 97. During voting, now these are certain interesting facts. 103 countries voted for, 3 voted against. That means China, Turkey, and Burundi. they voted against, and 27 abstained, which includes India. I mean, India also abstained from this thing. The treaty finally came into effect on 17th August 2014 after the 35th nation, that is Vietnam, ratified the convention. The treaty took more than 17 years to be implemented, as these issues were so contentious that the countries were showing extreme reluctance in binding them with the provision of this convention. And till date, uh, uh, obviously, India didn't sign it or has abstained from it. China voted against it. Uh, China has not entered into virtually any water sharing agreement other than certain old ones with North Korea. And basically, it looks at sharing of hydrological data, that too on case-to-case basis, and that too for a limited period of time. And in spite of being the upper riparian to almost 40, more than 40 rivers and the entire West Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, China refuses to accept any of these international laws and is still working on the concept of uh, uh, territorial sovereignty. Now, even though an obligation not to cause significant harm has been explicitly included in the convention, it also turns out to be one of the more controversial provisions, combined with the emphasis on joint mechanism and consultative cooperation built into the articles. So basically, the people who are upper riparian, they are not okay with the issue of equitable and reasonable utilization, whereas the people who are the upper riparians are not okay with the emphasis on causing no harm to the waterways, and the people who are lower riparians are not okay with the equitable and reasonable utilization. Now, why people, the lower riparians are not okay with it, or the upper riparians are not okay with these two is because, say, in case a country started its development late and it's an upper riparian, the lower riparian has already developed its resources. So the moment the upper riparian now starts developing its resources, the lower riparian says you're going to cause significant harm, and goes into a arbitration or goes into a dispute. So these are the issues which are affecting the usage or the sharing of water at various stages. Okay. I'll now come to the. There were a couple of other issues which are supposed to be there in this previous chapter, basically about the how the certain treaties have fared over the years, and also the conflicts which have happened. So those details are there, but I'm not covering them here for want of time, because they are more factual and less of analytical. Now, coming to the third chapter for the day, the Indo-Pak 7 decades of turbulent hydropolitics and counting. Uh, I will start with a brief on the rivers of the Indus water system. We are all aware the Indus River Basin. It is area is 1.12 million square kilometers, 47% in Pakistan, 39% in China, India, 8% in China, and 6% in Afghanistan. The annual inflow into Pakistan from India through just the western rivers is more than 170 cubic kilometers. And interestingly, the annual inflow into Pakistan through the eastern rivers, which are supposed to be a portion to us, is approximately 11 cubic kilometers. And this is something which we need to look at urgently. Coming to the a brief on the Indus River system, the 6 rivers. This is the Indus, the Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Satluj, and Beas. I'll cover these rivers one by one. Firstly, Indus River starts in one of the 2 rivers of Indus River system, which starts in China. Uh, it is the 12th largest river in the world, originates at an elevation of 5,500 meters. And the unique thing is that it contains 7 of the world's highest peaks after Mount Everest. Uh, the main dam on the river is the 6298 megawatt storage cum hydroelectric plant Tarbela, which is in Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa area. In addition, Park is constructing 5 more hydropower projects with a proposed total capacity of 21,270 megawatt at Bunji, Dasu, Daimar Bhasha, Ghazi Barotha, and Kalbag. Some of the dams are in POK, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and the others are in Pak Punjab. Bunji Dam, which is in POK, is being constructed by China. The reason being that anything in a disputed area, the international funding is not available. So, because they ask for a resolution or a no objection certificate from the other party. So basically, that is why China is coming, because it is using its own resources for funding these dams. Interestingly, no canals can take off from any dam on the Indus until it crosses into the relatively plain areas of Pak Punjab due to the course running through deep gorges and inhospitable terrain. And that is one reason why India has not been able to do much about the flow of the Indus River per se. Coming to the Jhelum, this rises in the Pir Panjal, the southeast part of Kashmir Valley, and catchment area of 39,000 square kilometers. It has the Wular, Dal, Manasbal, Gangabal, Nigin, and Anchar lakes on it. The river has 10 major tributaries, including the Kishan Ganga, or Neelam as Pakistan calls it. And Pakistan has 1150 megawatt storage cum hydroelectric Mangla Dam and 84 megawatt run of the river New Bong project, while 3 new dams with a total capacity of 2544 megawatt are under construction on this river. Chenab, again, it originates in Himachal. We have the following dams over it: Baglihar, Dulhasti, Pakal, which is under construction. And Pakistan, because it is only going into the plain area of Pakistan, so it has mainly got these barrages and headworks on this river. There are issues of contention on this large number of these dams, but that will get covered in the book. I'm not touching one here. Ravi, apportioned totally to India, rises in Kangra. It has these 5 major tributaries, and we have these basic dams on it. Beas, main dams on the Beas are the Pong, Pangdo, Larji in Himachal Pradesh. Rises in Himachal Pradesh and crosses over, joins Satluj before it crosses into Pakistan. This is Satluj River, the second river which originates in China, enters India at the Shipkila Pass. The length is 1556. It is the longest of the 5 rivers that flow through Punjab in northern India and Pakistan, other than, of course, before it meets Indus. Satluj River is also known as Satadari and is the easternmost tributary of the Indus River. The length is 1566 kilometers, 1556, and the dams which are there are all in India: Bakhda, Naptha, Jakri, Kacham, Kol, Nangal Dam, etc. So this is a brief on the rivers. I've put it in the book just so that for somebody who is not privy to it, all the details are available. Okay, now coming to the turbulent hydropolitics, per se, like I had mentioned earlier, a lot of it has been picked up from the seminar which I had attended, and the books and the other writings of Dr. Sinha, plus these other books which I had mentioned, Indus Divided by David Hines and Abdul Wahid, then Water Asia's New Battleground, and whole lot of these other books, including by Niranjan Gulati. Okay. In the context of India and Pakistan hydropolitics, IWT is the cornerstone and has over the years been studied and commented upon extensively. One of the most important and authentic source of background information on the making of the IWT is the insider's account of Indus Water Treaty and exercise in international mediation by Niranjan D. Gulhati. Uh, Indian Independence Act of 1947 was an act of British Parliament and provided for setting up of two independent dominions of India and Pakistan. And subsequently, two boundary commissions were set up under British lawyer Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who was tasked to demarcate the boundary for the division of the states of Punjab and Bengal between India and Pakistan. And he just got about 5 weeks to carry out this enormous task. With specific reference to the demarcation and division of the assets between the two Punjabs, Radcliffe considered the formidable irrigation system under joint control of both the sides, since as per him it was difficult to envisage a satisfactory decoupling of the river water system. So joint control was, in his thought process, the best way forward. However, this suggestion was met with contempt by both Nehru and Jinnah. In fact, Jinnah was known to have retorted that he'd rather have a desert in Pakistan than its field be watered by kind courtesy of Hindus. Nehru wasn't also agreeable, as at that point of time, he was looking at that use of water as part of the territorial sovereignty. But later on, he became a prime mover of the Indus Water Treaty, which is an irony, but I will be covering it subsequently, that why Nehru, being from the upper riparian country, was agreeable to this award. Radcliffe Award divided the irrigation system in Punjab. There were 19 headworks and 13 canals in the undivided Indus Basin. 4 of these headworks and 2 of these canals came to the then East Punjab, and remaining went to the Pakistan Punjab. The main issue was about the Upper Bari, Upper Bari Doab Canal and the Dipalpur Canal, whose headworks had come to India, while the canals, the Central Bari Doab Canal, the headworks, that is Madhopur and Firozpur, they came to the Indian Punjab. For Punjab, immediately it became a problem as to how to continue irrigating these fields once the Radcliffe Award was given. So as soon as sowing came up, the chief engineers of East and West Punjab met in December 2047 and signed an ad hoc agreement called the Standstill Agreement. On 1st April, India reneged on the Standstill Agreement and discontinued supply of water to UBDC and Dipalpur Canal. So similarly, the Pakistani Punjab or Pak Punjab representatives were then called for a meeting to Shimla, and there were two agreements which were signed there. Again, two standstill agreements, which recognized the need for apportioning some waters for Pakistan, and in return, Pakistan was to recognize India's claim to UBDC system and the Firozpur headwork. So the treaties were signed, but when they went back, Pakistan refused to ratify them. And simultaneously, on 21st April 1948, the UN Resolution 47 regarding the three-step process in Kashmir was adopted. So UN was increasingly and seeming to meddle in the subcontinental affairs, even beyond Kashmir. And Nehru was probably worried about the impact of it on Jamnagar, etc. And that forced Nehru to seek an early resolution on the water issue. Water was ultimately released on 30th April 1948, and an inter-dominion agreement called Delhi Agreement was signed on 4th May 1948. Subsequently, Pakistan then threatened to take the dispute to the International Court of Justice, and that was one of the reasons why Nehru, not wanting it to get internationalized and another issue reaching the UN, that he started becoming a prime mover for the Indus Water Treaty. Now, making of the Indus Water Treaty as such, Truman, who was the US president at the time, was watching the events unfold in the aftermath of the partition. There was a gentleman, David Lilienthal, who was the ex-chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and who also became later the chairman of US Atomic Energy Commission. He played an important role in shaping the IWT in the sense that he gave a start point for the negotiations to begin. Also, the role played by Eugene Black, then president of the World Bank, and his direct intervention by meeting the political leaders in the subcontinent had worked to bring the World Bank also into the equation. Lilienthal was actually had come to India based on to write an article He was sent by, there is a magazine, journal, Collier's magazine, which had funded his trip, though it was a private trip for a magazine, but it had apparently had the blessings of the US government. And after going back, he had written an article which said the making of another Korea. He had started off by discussing the Jammu Kashmir conflict between the issue of GK between India and Pakistan, and how it could lead to a big war in the subcontinent. And from there, he had derived that trying to sort out those two issues between the countries may not be feasible, but there are certain other issues which can immediately be sorted out, which can bring down the temperatures in the subcontinent. He had identified three issues. One was, of course, the issue of water sharing. The other was about the trade issue which had between India and Pakistan. And the third issue was about the returning of the women who had been kidnapped while the partition migration was going on. So the repatriation of those women. So he had recommended in his article that the best way forward, seeing the way the canal system is that India and Pakistan have a joint control over the canals. And he also mentioned that since the engineers from both the sides had been working together till about 3-4 years back, they would understand each other's language. And that was one way that rather than taking a political view of the problem, if a technical and an engineering view of the problem was taken, it could be easily be solved. So, of course, that was the start point with which Eugene Black came to both the Prime Minister and of India and Pakistan. And initially, the proposal given, the World Bank had asked for our proposals. I mean, when I say our, from Pakistan and India, while Pakistan gave a proposal of the entire western rivers going to them and 70% of the waters of eastern river going to them. India had mentioned all the eastern rivers coming to us, and I think 7% of the western rivers also coming to India. So that was the issue which became a roadblock, that there seemed to be no progress in the negotiations. And ultimately, then India had started building these Bhakra canals, and we were looking to inaugurate them. Also, simultaneously in Pakistan, a coup had happened, and General Muhammad Ayub Khan had taken over as president in Pakistan in 1958. And after a lot of back and forth, finally, once he took over, he immediately accepted the proposal which had been given by the final proposal which had been given by the World Bank, which mentioned that the western rivers go to Pakistan, the eastern rivers come to India, and that Pakistan will be given international funding for decoupling their canal network from the eastern rivers. And also, they'll be given some time in which to do that. And while that time period was on, India will continue to supply water even through the eastern rivers for the agriculture to be sustained. So that was the background, or the way the uh, negotiations had progressed. Okay. I had mentioned that why India signed IWT being upper riparian. There are a lot of talk and a lot of articles which mention that it was a blunder by Nehru, one of the blunders by Nehru, that India signed IWT even though we were the upper riparians. But there were a lot of reasons which forced him to do that. Possibly in hindsight, things may look different. But if you look at it from the context of the times that he was in, India was newly independent. We had a huge amount of poverty. Our entire, the Britishers had developed the entire canal network onto the side, or onto the part of Punjab which was apportioned to, which went to Pakistan, because our thing was more closer to the probably the foothills. So, and when the Redcliffe Award was given, though the headworks etc. they came to us, however the portion of the canal network which came to us was very, very minimal. We had lakhs and lakhs of acres of land which required irrigation. Water was there, but we didn't have the means of taking that water to that land. We required food aid, and USA was cold because of our non-alignment, which they were construing as being probably too close to the USSR bloc of countries. Water being a humanitarian issue, so India was losing international support. Also, in spite of the Redcliffe Award giving control of the waters to India, and like I said, the majority of the canal network being on Pak Punjab side, India did not even have enough storage to stop or divert these waters. I mean, once in fact, the standstill agreement of 1948 had been, India had pulled out of it. We had to, after some time, start releasing the water again because Ravi River was filling up with water, and our movement of troops and supplies for J&K, because the J&K issue was on that time, was causing a problem. So these are the some of the reasons which I felt that probably Nehru was forced to continue to look at signing the Indus Water Treaty. Okay, just this thing. I just want to highlight the basics of the Indus Water Treaty. This is the last part of the presentation. It has got 12 articles and 8 annexures. I'll just highlight the important ones. The articles basically lay down the crux of the issue, and the annexures are the details on how to go about the issues which are laid out in the articles. So Article 2 is regarding the provision of the eastern rivers to India. Article 3 is western rivers to Pakistan. The financial provisions, India was supposed to pay 62 million pounds towards to Pakistan for building of their as part of the international donation to Pakistan for building their canal network to decouple it from the eastern rivers. Settlement of differences and dispute. There is a very detailed procedure which is given for resolution of disputes. We have the commissioners of Indus Water nominated by both the countries in a permanent Indus commission. So that is the first point where the dispute is or a difference is supposed to be discussed. Followed by, in case it doesn't happen, then the neutral expert is called in. And there are certain set issues which can be forwarded to a neutral expert, which is also laid down in the treaty. And in case the neutral expert is also not able to give out award, then the difference is construed as a dispute, and then a court of arbitration. Again, the procedure is given. The court of arbitration is set, and then the award of the court of arbitration is treated as final and binding. Article 11, general provision. This is again important. It says that nothing in the treaty which is binding on any future treaties between the two countries. Also, the treaty cannot be used for furthering or undermining each other's existing territorial or other claims. So this was also given the provisions. Treaty was to be ratified. It was signed on 19th of September, but it was to be ratified backdate it was to come into retrospective effect from 1st April 1990. The treaty can only be replaced by a duly modified and ratified treaty. Until the time the modification or ratification is on, the original treaty will remain in vogue. There is no provision for abrogation of the same under any circumstances. So actually, it is a treaty in perpetuity, and wherein it raises a number of issues, especially now related to the climate change because of the changing amount of water which is coming in, and a whole lot of other issues. I'm not talking of the hybrid warfare issues. So this is one thing which we need to look at. The annexures, the important one is the Annexure C, agricultural use by India from the western rivers. we are allowed some specific pondage and some specific withdrawal of water for the Ranbir and Pratap canals. And India can continue to withdraw waters for area under cultivation as on 1st April 60. And Annexure D is the generation of hydroelectric power by India on the Western rivers. Again, very, very important annexure. We are allowed to run all power plants which were functional or under construction as on 1st April. Unrestricted right to generate hydroelectric power from the Western rivers, subject to stringent safeguards for the Pakistani interests. Informing Pakistan 6 months in advance as to any construction upstream, and Pakistan then has to lodge its defense or disagreement within 3 months. Okay, run of the river hydroelectric plants are allowed. Now, the one condition which is very explicitly given in is that for any 7 days worth of water received upstream has to be released within those 7 days only, because for even for the run of the river, this thing a little bit of pondage is required. I'm not getting technical details of that. And also it says that within a particular day, maximum minimum 30% and maximum 130% of the water can only be released. So which means that it is not that one India can stop the water in one day, suddenly let go of it on the 7th day and cause a flooding downstream. So there are very stringent measures which have been built into it. India is specifically allowed to construct off-channel storage on Jhelum River for flood control. We are aware that Vular Belaj, Tulbul navigational project issue is on. Court of arbitration I have already mentioned. And the Indus Water Treaty was signed in 1960. And it was co-signed by the WAB, Mr. WAB Ilif, who signed it, who was the vice president and signed it on behalf of the World Bank. Okay. Just a perspective on the IWT. The treaty concluded a long drawn and often hostile negotiation, which saw the final document taking shape in a spirit of give and take. Even though India was the upper riparian, yet it was Nehru who pushed for the agreement. It concluded with the signing of the historic World Bank facilitated accord, which has stood the test of 3 wars and continuing hybrid war. It incorporated all the principles enshrined in the accepted doctrines concerning transboundary waters, namely limited territorial sovereignty and the community of interest. It also incorporated all the accepted international laws, like the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization, obligation not to cause significant harm, consultation and negotiation, etc. These concepts were incorporated long before the 1997 UN Convention on Non-Navigational Uses of the Watercourses was signed. Interestingly, though, India was one of the countries which abstained from voting during the adoption of the UN resolution, even though our Indus Water Treaty is cited as an enduring and comprehensive agreement by the international community. With this, I have come to the end of the 3rd chapter also, and I'll request for comments and questions, please.